Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's distinguished guest, Marvin Odum, who was appointed Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Houston by Mayor Sylvester Turner in September of 2017, less than 1 month after Hurricane Harvey inflicted historic damage on the largest metropolitan area in Texas and the 4th largest metropolitan area in the country. In that capacity, Mr. Odum leads the efforts still ongoing to secure and deploy disaster resources to aid in and accelerate Houston's recovery. It is an unpaid post, not by design, but by his dictate. Mr. Odum has accepted no salary for what has absolutely been a full-time job. Previously, he spent more than 30 years, that is more than half his life, at Shell Oil Company, retiring as the global energy conglomerate's chairman and president and as an executive committee member of Royal Dutch Shell. Born in Houston, raised in the same Memorial neighborhood where he still lives, Mr. Odum has an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Houston, though I'm sure after the dean's remarks, he regrets not attending the McCombs School. Please join me in welcoming Marvin Odum. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Evan.
Grateful to see you. Please confirm for the assembled audience that we did not look into the future when we planned this event and say, let's have you come the day after a terrible hurricane.
No, I can assure you we would not do that to anyone.
We did not do that. But I'm going to take advantage. The news hands you things, bad things and good things, but they hand you things. And I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we're sitting here on the heels of a terrible hurricane. What would you tell your equivalents in Florida, given what you've learned over the last year about what they're about to face?
Well, I think the first thing is pretty obvious. Take a deep breath.
Right.
Kind of just let it sink in and prepare for the long haul, because that's what it's going to be.
Don't make rash decisions?
No, I think there's a case for that. But of course, what happens right after the storm is this immediate response where lives are in danger, people are in desperate conditions.
Right.
That's the only thing that matters. You do everything you can to affect that.
Yeah.
There's going to come a time in a couple of weeks when you get through that stage, and it really is when you start to think about how do we put this city, this area back together again. What are the big components of that? What sort of team do I need to make that happen? What's possible? And that's an important thought process. My recommendation to them would be what we did, which is start reaching out and find people that have done this before and get some good experience. We reached out to people that were there post-Katrina, post-Sandy, and other disasters, just to better understand the components of what a good recovery looks like.
Right, there's absolutely no beating experience at this, right? If you've seen a hurricane, you at least have the basis for decisions that you're going to make going forward. Hard to start from scratch.
Absolutely, because it's not the kind of thing that you just inherently know. Right. I mean, there's so many different aspects to it. I'm looking at part of the team that's helped with the recovery here in Houston, and just understanding the federal down to the state, down to the locality, disaster recovery system is incredibly complex, and there's tens, if not hundreds of different components. There's all sorts of requirements. So just that basic understanding is just not something that's in the natural way of thinking.
Right, and as I've heard you say before and have read you say to reporters and interviewers, this is a long-term play.
Well, that's
the recovery process is a long-term process.
Yeah, when I say take a deep breath, and this is a discovery for me personally as you come in, is you think about a housing. We probably had the largest housing disaster in the history of the U.S. as part of Harvey, and I speak about the entire region.
Right.
Certainly, we can see that in Houston. Putting that situation back together is probably a minimum of a 6-year program. Minimum.
6 years.
6 years.
Right.
When you start thinking about the important aspect of how do you keep this from happening again, infrastructure programs, better drainage.
Right.
Then you're talking about a 10 to 15-year program minimum.
Yeah.
So this really is about long-term strategic approach.
Right.
Using the money that does come as part of disaster recovery in the most strategic way to make those long-term changes that are going to help you.
Yeah, people are impatient generally about fixing things when things go wrong, and especially on a grand scale. Everybody's problem is the most important and most immediate thing that needs to be fixed. Right now, come fix my problem. People don't have the ability, and understandably, they don't have the ability to have perspective on this as a piece of a larger puzzle. Are we right, generally speaking, the royal we, to be impatient with how long this takes? When you see how the governments, federal government, state government, local government interact, can this be better? Can this be more efficient? Or is it just going to take as long as it takes?
Thank you for asking that question. I think there's enormous value in patience.
Yeah.
I mean, not impatience, in impatience in this case. Yeah, because you've got to have that energy to improve something that, I don't want to be critical of something that's there that's intended to help, but this is a broken process. If you think about disaster recovery from the federal level down to the locality, I'll give you an example. So there's about $1.2 billion to help with housing coming to Houston from Housing and Urban Development. That money is expected to arrive, the first wave of that money is expected to arrive in December, 16 months after the storm.
Right.
Now, I'm a process guy. Big company, big projects. We look at how things work. We work on making things more efficient all the time. I'm watching this process and living it as we speak in a very impatient way, knowing that with some just, dedicated process redesign, you could cut that time in half.
And as the CEO, the CEO of a global conglomerate like Shell Oil, as the CEO, you have that get it done power. You at least have the power of the oratorical authority, right? I mean, you could say, get this done. And I have to believe that coming out of the business world, I mean, that really is the theme of our conversation today in the main. Coming out of the business world as the CEO, when you are the guy in charge, it is one thing to say to a team, get something thorny and complicated done. It's another thing to work in government, which seems to be designed not to get things done.
Yeah, and it compels me to say something else too, which is, for somebody coming out of business, it's just almost terminally frustrating how long this takes and the process you go through, and just understanding that process. At the same time, what I recognize is it's a systems problem. It's not a people problem, right? And that's an important distinction.
Systems, not people. Explain that.
I have come to know people from the federal level all the way down to people working in the city of Houston government, and they are incredibly dedicated, powerful people, bright people, wanting to do the same type of things that you would want to do if you were in that position, but the systems are broken.
Right. So no matter how well-meaning you are, no matter your intentions, you can't necessarily get everything done the way you
and it doesn't mean every character is a good character, so there's exceptions to every rule, but I just want it to be understood, this is a systems problem, a design problem, not necessarily an individual attitude problem.
You just described this as frustrating, having been the CEO of a major company, now going into work with government, understanding the obstacles that are erected before you. Why'd you want this gig? You had a really good life, and you also are young enough at this point that you could have enjoyed your retirement, having done well for yourself professionally, personally.
I still plan on doing that.
Well, why'd you want this gig?
You almost have to put yourself in the situation. And I know everybody listening here can relate to this. Just bring yourself back to the devastation after Hurricane Harvey. You're watching it on television, and you're seeing it in your neighborhoods.
This is your hometown.
It's my hometown, and it's just incredibly devastating. And you're sitting there wondering, how does this ever get put back together again? With this degree of damage, never having seen anything like it. A phone call comes, and it's the mayor, and I usually tell this story where I'm looking at my phone, it's a number I don't recognize, and I never answer my phone when it's a number I don't recognize. It's just a principle that I have.
Smart move. Right?
It is. I think it's a really good principle.
Yeah.
But I did answer it this time, maybe because of that situation, and it was the mayor on the other side, and basically his request was, would you come in and lead this effort as part of the recovery?
Right.
And I did what a lot of people would do. I said, let me think about it. Thank you for the call. And I called a few people that I trust. Everybody calls those kind of individuals, and got lots of advice around, make sure you understand the resources, the mandate, the time frame, and all this stuff. And after I made those calls, it's only a few hours later, I'm looking at the television, and there's the mayor back in another emergency operations center, basically trying to save lives. And I said, okay, it doesn't matter what all the answer to all those questions. I'm just going to say yes, and I'll come in and I'll do whatever I can do.
You've been called, basically.
Yeah, and just do whatever. And, actually from the first moment, it just feels, from a personal standpoint, it feels so purposeful, right? You just know you're doing something that's important to a lot of people. Right. I have all those connections that you mentioned, being my hometown and its neighbors, basically. and have never looked back since then.
Yeah.
I mean, the energy to come in every morning and try to make this happen in a better way is endless.
Yeah. You had some experience, did you not? Did you not work in some respects on the Katrina recovery in your previous job, in your previous capacity?
In a sense, not in this type of capacity, but after Katrina, of course, New Orleans being totally devastated, we had about 4,000 employees in the New Orleans area.
This is what I mean. You had experience in your own way with what happens in a situation like this.
Right. So, and it helped me, I have to say, to a degree, because you had some sense of time frames and that type of thing associated with recovery. But after Katrina, we had, basically 4,000 or so employees in the area that effectively had no place to live.
Yeah.
And so, our recovery as part of that process started with basically bringing everybody to Houston, helping them maintain and stabilize their lives while we, stabilize the business. And then very quickly started to engage back with New Orleans about, did it make sense for people to come back? When might people be able to come back? How do we as a large and influential company, how do we help that recovery in the New Orleans area? So from that standpoint, we're very involved.
Right. Would you help us understand Harvey in context? So we've had Harvey, we had Maria in Puerto Rico. That Puerto Rico situation has become a political football among the many things that has become terrible disaster, but it's also become a big political football. We just had Florence. We've just had Michael. Every time I hear, it's sort of a perverse version of Texas pride. Every time I hear people talk about how their hurricane is bigger than ours, I say, no, it's not. Ours is bigger. Can you help set us straight on where Harvey fits into the landscape of these storms? Because I thought I heard them say that there was more rain during Florence, or that the damage they're projecting for Michael, although they don't yet really know what the outcome of this is going to be, that somehow Michael might have a bigger impact on that part of the world than Harvey did.
I don't think there's a lot of, if you get to the people that have all that data, I don't think there's a lot of question that Harvey has the broadest impact of all the storms that you mentioned. Okay. It's just from a destruction point of view, from a damage point of view, it's just enormous and well over $100 billion.
Yeah.
So you'll see less than that most likely. I think the numbers that are being thrown around for the Carolinas right now are more like $60 million. The estimates don't really matter at this point for the Florida Panhandle in that area because it's too early to know, I think. But from the breadth of devastation of Harvey, which was largely a rain event. I mean, it was very much a hurricane wind event in parts of Texas, but for the majority of the damage that was done, it's very much a rising water event. I think it's unmatched in terms of its devastation.
Yeah. A lot of people, now this is, of course, hindsight always being 20/20. A lot of people after the fact, and we actually had done reporting before the fact that was actually stuff that people pointed to after the fact, said Houston and Harris County should have been better prepared for this. That the signs were in place, it was clear that there was at least vulnerability. Have you come in the last year to believe, looking backward, not that it matters at this point, that there was stuff that the city and the county should have done to keep the consequences of this from what they were?
It's an interesting question because I remember making the personal decision and then trying, as we're leading this team, trying to lead the team from the perspective of it really just doesn't matter, right? Yeah. The only thing that matters about the past is what can you learn from it in terms of what you might do differently.
Well, that does matter, right?
In the future. But pointing to the past and saying, look at this problem, look at what those people did, look at what these development rules allowed, there's just not a lot of value in that. Understand where you are today and where you need to go and what needs to be done to get to a better place is
So then let's talk about the takeaways from the storm forward rather than the storm backward. What's the most important thing you've learned about this recovery process in terms of Houston going forward in the last year?
Well, it's, there's two words, depending on which one you like to use.
Yeah.
There's the term resilience or there's the term mitigation. Both, to me, are the most important words coming out of Harvey as you look forward. Think about, I'll focus on Houston, but this translates into most of the big metropolitan areas or municipalities across the state. At least 4 major flooding disasters in the last handful of years. Now that's, you're just to the point where you say, this has to be fixed. So one of the things that Harvey did was it helped push both a public understanding and a political will to a place where you've now opened up the landscape to do something about it. And that's extremely important. Now, Harvey was also of a scale such that there's quite a bit of money coming to the area, so that you can look at some of those strategic things, those fundamental elements that have to be shifted in the city structure, the way things are done, how water is handled. There's enough money coming to actually start to shift the trajectory of the city from that perspective.
In some ways, it took something at this magnitude.
I think it did.
Horrible that it happened. You'd rather it not have happened, but if it's going to happen, one of the silver linings ends up being that finally the attention is focused on these problems and the resources come into Houston.
And one of the important things that happens early on is this conversation around, and this was a fascinating conversation if you're sitting, in city council meetings or you're sitting in front of groups in the public around the Houston area, of what was Harvey? Was Harvey a one-off sort of freak event, never to be repeated?
Yeah.
Or is Harvey the new baseline on which you want to design for where you want to be in the future?
Right.
And we on the recovery team took a very firm stance, by the way, with 100% support of the mayor, and the mayor was probably there even before we were,
right,
which is Harvey's a new baseline.
Right.
What we want to design for is Harvey plus a safety factor on top of that.
Solve for 10X essentially, right? Solve for the big problem, because you don't want to under-respond.
Exactly.
Right.
And we talked about the number of storms over the last couple of years. You talked about that from at least a national perspective. There is a trend here in terms of frequency and intensity that you just simply cannot deny.
Yeah. Do you take, I interviewed Senators Cruz and Cornyn at the Tribune Festival 2 years ago, barely a month after Harvey, and I said, are you guys ready to have a different conversation about climate after this? And their answer was basically, no. Should we be having a different conversation about climate, Mr. Odum?
Well, certainly, yeah. It seems pretty obvious,
well, certainly.
Right?
That's pretty definitive, isn't it?
But I think it's also, I think there's plenty of space here. Let me say it this way.
Yeah.
If somebody is of a mind to think in terms of climate and changing climate and the result on these type of events, easy to have that conversation in that area. If somebody doesn't want to go there in that context, I have no problem having the conversation that says 4 major disastrous events in 5 years.
Right.
There's a trend here that you can't deny. Let's do something about fixing how we respond to what is obviously going to continue to happen. And just keep it contained to that. And we get effectively, you don't get to the same point from addressing the bigger issue of climate, but you get to the same local answer in terms of how do you deal with flood mitigation and that type of thing.
So I asked you about what your biggest takeaways were, and you said whether it's resilience or mitigation, it's somewhere in that space. What was the thing that surprised you or has surprised you the most over the last year about this recovery work that you were not anticipating at the beginning?
Well, I think something, again, I'm looking at the faces in the room. I'm just imagining if you stepped into the same role that you would be as astounded as I was about how complex these situations are. So let's talk about housing. The amount of housing damage that was done, the breadth of that across the city. You would think it's all about just rebuilding those homes, putting money out there and letting people rebuild where they are. But then you get into the point of, but what is in a world where the dollars are much less than the actual need,
right?
And you have to make very hard choices. Where does that money go? And how do you deal with what you would consider an equitable recovery across the city? Extremely challenging. Do you just rebuild things the way they are, or do you try to make sure that every dollar that goes back into that reconstruction puts that particular structure or entity in a position where it's not vulnerable to the same thing the next time?
Right.
Now, if you want to do that, it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to take more money. It means, more money into concentrated areas, which means other people do without. It's just a very, very complex subject where choices have to be made.
And people are stubborn and complicated often themselves, right? So you can have a plan up here, but at the end of the day, the decisions about rebuilding, living in homes, fall as much into the hands of the homeowners, right, of the individuals, as they do of the people at the policy-making level. So you've got to actually persuade people in these communities that change is necessary when they themselves may be stubborn, right, and not want change.
Yeah, so there's that whole, and you described it very well, Evan, there's that whole, sort of thought process around the homeowner themselves. There's then all the government layers, and again, in this process, you're talking about local all the way to federal on virtually every topic. You're dealing with every layer. And then there's a whole group of stakeholders that are advocates for fair housing and that type of thing, that are big players in this picture as well.
Yeah. Let me ask you about some of the players in all this. Of course, many of the people who work for the mayor, as you do, are sitting here, so don't worry, he's not going to hear about this. I'm sure they won't go back and tell him. But talk about the mayor. Talk about the mayor's role in this. Talk about the county's role in this. I want to go 3 levels: local, state, and federal. Talk about the local officials and their role alongside you in this effort.
Well, I think the first thing is the mayor, the county judge, Judge Ed Emmett, who is the one that really you see visibly in a response type, immediately after disaster in a response mode, heroic efforts. I mean, they have just done an outstanding, world-class job in that immediate response to the disaster.
Coordination of the city and the county has been good?
It's been good. I think and I'll say a little bit more about that, but the other thing about the mayor is, I give the mayor enormous credit, not only for his leadership and the response, but then, it was only a number of days after the storm that he called me.
Yeah.
It's not about me. This is the fact that the mayor's sitting there saying, I recognize that we need help in this recovery, that I can't do this by myself. That's a hugely important leadership attribute, to be able to recognize that and do something about it. And I give him enormous credit for doing that. And as I then came in and we started to build a team, his mandate was just as broad as it needs to be, meaning you do what you need to do. I want you to make me personally very uncomfortable, bring me the hard choices. I want to make the hard choices and get the right things in place, take the long-term view. So I couldn't have asked for a better mandate from that perspective.
Right, and you were going to come back to the county and the city, because occasionally these turf battles, politics is every place, politics is in everything. Occasionally turf battles break out at moments when you don't expect them to. How'd the county and the city get along?
Yeah, and the summarized view is Harvey changed a lot of things. Harvey also changed the ability of entities like the city and the county to work much better together. So they're always side by side, they're overlapping, they've always kind of intersected and done okay from that perspective. I've only been in this situation for a little over a year, but I will tell you now, the coordination between those two groups is better than it's ever been, probably in the history of those two entities, because it's now extremely well coordinated around solving these problems, which are very much common problems, and actually together going to advocate, as you talk about the other levels, to the state, and going together to the federal government. And those turf battles are just kind of moving to the side. Now, there's always a little bit of that in the background. I mean, I think that's just the reality
it's inevitable. Human nature.
Boundaries. It's human nature, but it has been overpowered in this case.
So talk about the state. You had a couple of different actors at the state level. You have the governor, of course, who is the leader of the overall efforts by the state to be helpful, to bring its resources and power to bear. You had the land commissioner, George P. Bush, who had a large responsibility for housing in particular and the housing response. You have John Sharp, the chancellor of the A&M system, who was installed essentially as the state level version of Marvin Odum, right? The sort of recovery czar for the state, the Commission to Rebuild Texas. Talk about how the state played a role in this from your perspective.
Well, the state, of course, just the purview alone is sort of a different orientation, looking at the entirety of the state. I think the piece I would call out, Evan, would be something that we started working fairly early on, which is, in this case, Houston and Harris County overlapping, but an enormous entity with actually quite a bit of capability existing in those metropolitan entities, have the ability to affect this recovery with the funding, basically, not on their own, but as more of an independent type entity.
Right.
As opposed to needing to be led out of Austin in terms of how you want to affect a housing recovery program or what infrastructure projects need to be done. So we started advocating from the very beginning that help us get the money,
but then give us latitude.
Then let us do it.
Right.
We can do this at a local level. And there were times when that was a contentious discussion, but if I just short circuit to the final answer, on the housing program, we were asking for the money to come directly from the federal government to Houston, not through the state and then to us. By the time we finished all these conversations, there was actually a letter from the governor, from George P. Bush, Commissioner Bush, as well as the county judge and the mayor directly to HUD saying, we request that you send this money directly.
So there was alignment and agreement in the end.
There was alignment in the end. There was a good alignment around that.
Right.
Now, the federal government, interestingly, did not choose to do that. And so that money is now following that line down through the state, down through the other groups, and then eventually makes its way to Houston. It's hard to put an exact context around that, but when I said the housing money will arrive in Houston in December, it probably could have arrived sometime late summer.
So why can't the federal government just do what you asked? I do not understand it. If you have the state and the local, I know I understand it, but I don't understand it. I do not want to accept the answer. I mean, so you did a town hall meeting in Kingwood 2 nights ago.
Right.
And I'm going to read back your words to you, but characterize this. So you were talking to Kingwood residents at a town hall on Tuesday night. And you noted that while $2.5 billion in funding should be coming from FEMA for Houston infrastructure repairs, at this point, a year plus later, only $200 million had come so far. So only $200 million out of $2.5 million. And this was your quote at the town hall. This is a long-term process. This is just painfully slow. FEMA is so overloaded. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's slow, and we just have to recognize that. Why? Why do we have to recognize? Why do we accept less than what government should do for us? I'm continually amazed. I'm not surprised, but I'm amazed that we put up with this. Why should we accept this?
So you shouldn't lose asking that question or the energy with which you ask that question. I will tell you from my point of view, and the reason why you see a statement like that is we have to work this on 2 parallel tracks. One is you actually have to live within the system that exists and work that system the absolute best way possible. I carry a parallel track of conversation at all the levels of government that you're talking about that says, let's please take the time and step back and redesign this system and improve it from what it is today.
Yeah.
So, understanding that FEMA only has so many resources, this is the part I know that they've had X number of disasters in the last 18 months.
Let us acknowledge FEMA is stretched to the limits or beyond the limits of its capabilities.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
And so, when it comes to affecting a city infrastructure repair, which is what the $2.5 billion are, we have 350 major projects in the city of Houston. And the process is, we have to assess the damage. FEMA has to individually assess the damage. You have to agree on that number. And then you have to have a negotiation for, in addition to the money to repair, what mitigation money makes sense so that you don't put that asset right back in the same situation if you have another flood the next year.
Right.
350 of those. So that's why, that's a challenging, if I put this in a business context, this is a joint venture project negotiation on each 350 of those in a sense.
Yeah.
And that takes time. And now we're dealing with a case where, of course, FEMA, as we said, is stretched.
Yeah. So before we pivot off of Harvey into the broader conversation about business and politics, let me just understand the math here. So the federal government basically said we're going to do 90% of the cost, right? I have that correct.
Yeah.
Right. So saying you're going to do 90% of the cost, but then not providing you 90% of the money on a timetable that allows the city and residents of the city to move forward seems a little problematic to me. In other words, what good is saying we're going to do 90% if you don't actually provide that money? So then the city and residents of the city, and again, I'm not blaming this particular administration, I'm blaming government generally. If you say you're going to do 90%, the city wants to get moving. If you don't have the money, how do you get moving?
Yeah, and so again, it's probably just worth one more shot at describing why it is what it is from my perspective.
Well, but Mr. Odum, I understand the why part. I'm asking though, as a practical matter, what do you do? I understand the why. I get the why. But like as a practical matter, what do you do if you don't have the money?
Well, it's a little bit obvious, meaning you wait.
You wait.
Because there's quite a bit that you can't do. I think the other thing, if you call it a bit of a revelation, coming in as someone who's been around the city all my life, but actually seeing it from the inside out.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is different than probably any other city out there, is how stretched the resources are, how thin the balance sheet is, meaning the money comes in and the money is dedicated going out to some sort of service. So the ability to have a lot of surplus funds respond to something like a disaster. It's just not there.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's a lot of alternatives to move faster until the federal money gets there.
Of course, the state, there are actors at the state level who say, in the absence of the federal government writing that check now, there is money in the rainy day fund. For God's sakes, it rained. That was the problem. Why didn't the state provide more money, or could the state have provided more money, let me ask it that way, up front? If the feds were waiting to get us the money that we needed to rebuild Houston and Harris County, couldn't the state have done more?
I'm surprised you don't have a quote from me on that, on
Go ahead.
that piece. So that request has been made. It's been made by virtually everybody out there, including the city of Houston, to let's tap into that.
Yep.
A lot of reasons to come back, requires a special session, on and on. There was, to be perfectly balanced in the response, there was some money that was provided from the state
Indeed.
on the front end to help us get the debris picked up and other elements like that, and that was extremely helpful and important.
I saw that press conference.
The question is, do you have bigger distributions to allow some of these projects to start moving forward, which you could then even reimburse later when the federal money got there?
Correct.
Now, I think it's the right question. I don't think there's been a satisfactory answer to it.
You believe that they ought to go, so
I think that should be what's happening.
you believe they should be taking money out of the state's bank account, now not waiting, and making some of this stuff happen now, not waiting?
Yes, there are certainly some priority projects that should be getting that funding now. And that money could be reimbursed when the federal money comes in. I wanted, while we're talking about, you mentioned the 90%, I think this is important. One of the aspects of having a recovery team, and again, I keep looking at the team here, and the way the mayor set this up in the city of Houston, one of the beneficial elements of that is that it's a group that doesn't think along the normal ruts of how things work, right? So Houston's been, Ike, and other storms and other floods, been in this scenario of federal funding many times. And you sort of follow that process, and I'm exaggerating for a reason. As you look at now something of the scale of Harvey, $2.5 billion of damage just to the city assets. The 90% of that is an enormous help. 10% of that, $250 million, which is the match requirement that has to come from the local entity, is just not something the city has. And so one of the first things we did was we said, some other states have done this in the past, couldn't the state of Texas actually provide that match out of the rainy day fund so that these municipalities around the state don't have to try to figure out where's that money going to come from?
Right.
So the answer to that so far has been no. With the answer to that being a no, what this team was able to do is say, what other solutions do we have to this problem? And so to try to make this story short, what we ultimately did was we went back to FEMA and said, for this $250 million, can we count anything we can get on a voluntary or donated basis? Can we count that towards our 10% match? And series of conversations, a lot of people make the point the federal government can't change, you can't do this, you can't do that. We pushed on this on a monthly basis for about 6 months, and actually FEMA came in and put in a new policy where they said donated resources can be an offset to that 10% match. So now the city of Houston and every other city in Texas has the opportunity to offset that match requirement by having the community involvement, the business involvement.
So J.J. Watt solves your problem, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation solve your problem. Is that what we're talking about? We're talking about donated stuff, we're talking about philanthropy?
It's a little more narrow than that. So it is philanthropy, but it has to be donated, either activities through individuals or groups of people, or materials to permanent projects. So think of these $2.5 billion that go into city projects. Now that can be repairing a park, it can be repairing a municipal courts building.
Basically you're keeping a ledger, essentially, right?
So what I'm
up the donated
exactly.
services.
So what I'm looking for is, are there law firms who can help us get some of these contracts in place for these 350 projects and do that on a donated basis? That would count. Shell donated 2 floors and 1 Shell Plaza to us to put this recovery team in place.
Right.
That ought to count. So, that's an opportunity.
Good.
And that comes from a team that's not sort of stuck in the normal way of doing things and can think about other ways to solve these problems.
So what did your experience in business all those years do to prepare you for a situation like this? I want to broaden this conversation because this is a leadership role. You were in a significant leadership role before, but it's a different kind of leadership role. What did being in the business world do to prepare you for this sort of public service?
Well, I think probably ought to characterize that first. So Shell as an entity, I mean, basically second largest energy company in the world, 70 countries. If you take the employees and the contractors working at any given time, it's probably 500,000 or more. It's a big bureaucratic global entity that would rival any government. So I just say that because I dispel a little bit this rumor that business is all streamlined and everything's easy and just like that. There's no
fair point.
I mean, these are big because the issues are equally complicated, right? So I think that actually was pretty decent preparation for this. Now the difference, one of the big differences is the resources and the capacity to do things is just so much different.
Yep.
Now, companies are more focused. Shell was more focused, but I missed that capacity. And so, learning to do things without that sort of capacity, things have to start to shift, and some of that's timeline and pace, the elements we were talking about.
Mr. Odum, one of the knocks on government is that it's slow to change, it does not like disruption, it's hidebound, and that business, at least in a general sense, you're able to streamline processes. You're able to pivot a little bit more quickly, make changes, be innovative, be disruptive. That may be overstating the ability of business to be disruptive.
No, I think that's fair. No, it's fair.
And so I wonder if there's a disconnect in that respect, that again, I acknowledge that Shell may be a big bureaucracy and that there were probably more things in common with government in that respect than fewer, but at the same time, the idea of running a business, you really do have control, whereas your stakeholders in government are all of us.
Yeah.
And it's much harder to turn that chip.
Yeah, the comment about Shell and the bureaucracy was a little tongue-in-cheek, but there are some parallels there. I think some of the main differences is your ability to say why or why not is very different. And maybe more importantly, the incentive to say why or why not. How do we do this faster? How do we do this more efficiently?
Yeah.
The incentives in business are there.
Right.
All the way down to the individual level. There are incentives for individuals to take risk along that way of thinking. I don't see that in most elements of government.
Well, government, in fact, is by nature risk averse.
You don't want to be in a position of basically screwing something up, right? There's just no benefit in that. So better to take the time, make sure it follows the process.
Right.
Exactly.
I was interested when you were talking about housing. I was interested to think about specifically this discussion of rebuilding housing and talking to the building industry about things that have to happen, that we're not going to simply fix the areas of the city that flooded and not worry about the parts that didn't flood. We're trying to take, as you said, a longer term view. How do we prevent this from happening again? Let's not do the least possible, but let's have a bigger sense of the responsibility. And you said in some context, I've been in industry, I understand this. I kind of thought to myself, that was interesting as a way to connect business experience with government experience. You've been on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
In the case of a lot of these industries that have to come to the table as part of the recovery, and you can say, look, I've been in your shoes. I understand the difficulty that you're facing at this moment being in business because I've been in business. That actually is a useful weapon in your arsenal, isn't it?
It was. No, it's very helpful. Actually, coming two elements here, just to be perfectly frank, coming from business, so being a newcomer to the business, there's all kinds of leeway you get because you're a newcomer into the area. Doing it without a salary also gives you that, you're just more independent, you have more ability to be the outsider and to push things that maybe don't follow the norms.
Well, you're not obligated to do this. It's more of an Elio Mai scenario or volunteer thing. It's more of a good steward of the community role.
But Evan, I think the point you were bringing up is really important. So, you think about the regulations that would be directed towards an oil and gas company. They're pretty immense and sort of always coming at a rapid pace. So that was part of the context in which I was talking to the developers and others. I understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of those regulations. We need you to help us get them right. But I also don't need you screaming saying they're worse than they are. Because what I know is that a well-designed regulation around fixing a problem, that you as a business will find a way to very effectively get that done.
Right.
And so having that context has been helpful. Yeah.
Generally speaking, there's a big conversation out in the world, especially on the progressive end of the spectrum politically, that the business community and government are too cozy, and that the business community influences the byproducts of government too much. Agree or disagree?
I think it's way overblown.
You think so?
Yeah, I mean, because I think in a lot of contexts, when people make that statement, I would have to think, big oil is pretty close to the top of that list when they think about people that are influencing things. Or at the top.
Right.
And so, but, I can take, real personal experience, spending a lot of time in Washington, which is maybe part of the context as well, around what needs to be done, what's important, environmental aspects, workforce aspects, the whole breadth of issues, and in the context of a transitioning world, and having very deep conversations around that topic. And I will tell you, you don't get what you want necessarily. The good news is you can get invited into the room and you have a chance to bring that expertise to bear.
But being in the room doesn't necessarily get you everything you want.
It doesn't get you everything that you want. Not by any means. I have to say, a lot of that context is money.
Sure.
This is I think this is a fair statement. So, my perspective, if you look at Royal Dutch Shell is an Anglo-Dutch company at its roots. That's where it came from. There's a very different sort of political dynamic in Europe versus what there is in the US. And you wouldn't see a lot of political giving in Europe, for example. It's a different kind of mindset and scenario. So we sort of have a little bit of that in our DNA when it comes to being here in the US. And my perspective in Washington as a business, and a big business that needs to be influential, was we bring expertise, content, capacity, whatever you need to solve a problem, but it's not about political donations. So, I mean, you can look at my history of giving. I'm not a big fan of giving political donations or to that sort of process. And you can look at the company. We have a very small PAC. It was sort of given equally on both sides of the aisle. But it was a very different perspective that we brought to that whole process.
You understand you're unique, or you're rare at least. Let me say you're rare in that respect.
But what I'm saying is I wasn't excluded from that process for that reason.
By virtue of not giving.
Nor do I think we had a lot less influence.
Right.
Because of,
Does business give let me ask the question in a different way. Does business give as much as it gets? Do you think that business, generally speaking, big business, corporate America, does as much for communities as the system does or benefits it?
Yes, I do, actually. I say that from the perspective, I don't say that from the perspective of sitting in a chairman or president's office. I say that from the perspective of, think about the 20 or so thousand people that we would have in the Houston area, and how do they feel about what they do and what they contribute and how they're part of that society, and being able to see, because we communicate that, what the business does as a whole. 98% of those people would say yes. I think, and I think that's a powerful component.
Yesterday I was out at the Hyatt Lost Pines in Bastrop at a conscious capitalism conference. A bunch of CEOs of companies concerned about the culture of their companies, the culture of the world, the business community's impact on the larger world, doing good by doing well, all that sort of stuff. And this was a persistent topic of conversation at this conference. Are we doing enough serving our shareholders, serving our stakeholders, doing capitalism? Are we doing enough to think about the impact of our work on the lives of the people who work for us and the lives of the people who are our
I think this transition's been happening for a long time, but that is such a big component of what, my experience is a big global company, what we do. I'd be really interested in hearing the McCombs leadership thoughts on this as well. But the idea that the world is facing just some enormous, challenging issues. Again, because it's come up in the context climate, but it could be health issues, workforce issues, a number of different things. You have to have business at the table helping to solve those problems. Government can't solve those problems on their own. Businesses
can't, and is probably these days especially not inclined to solve those problems.
And there are dwindling resources to do that. And I think business recognizes that we can have a big role in that, and actually see it as part of an obligation, yes, but long-term success of the company, absolutely. So being part of the solution for these problems. Now, if I go directly to energy, let me talk from a Shell point of view, but I think we're now to a point where this is shared by virtually all the big energy companies. The world is going through a transition. We are part of driving that transition in a very smart, very economic, economically supporting way. But we have to be part of that change. And we see that. We dedicate time, people, effort, a lot of thought.
Yeah.
Shell, in terms of the scenarios it builds, exactly towards how do you solve some of those problems.
We're going to go to questions in a second. I want to encourage you, if you have questions in the audience, to come line up at the mic. I'm going to ask a last question of our guest. I'm going to bait you to talk about President Trump, whose name I've waited to mention for 50 minutes because it was a good thing to wait, but also by law as a journalist, I'm required to mention him once an hour. So I thought I had to mention him. We have seen over the last 2 years or so, less than 2 years with his administration in office, the economy has come to a new place, a lot of good economic news. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, if you were in the stock market, you might offer an alternate view of that. And apparently the futures markets overnight were trending that today's apparently going to be another bad day. I don't know what's happened so far. Are the tax cuts good now that you're outside of business and you're just an American, a civilian? Are the tax cuts that we saw good? Are the tariffs that have been proposed, which may in fact have been the catalyst for this stock market decline yesterday, as opposed to the Fed, as the president said? Are the tariffs good? Are we seeing good things or bad things happen as it relates to the business climate in this country and the economy relative to your experience?
So I think I'll just, to make it efficient and short, I'll just give you my personal view,
okay,
which I think is what you're asking for.
Well, you're no longer a Shell, so you can't give me the Shell view. That's fine.
I just want to classify it as my personal
view. Go ahead.
I think tax cuts, they have a place. I think they probably were bigger than they needed to be. Well, that's my opinion. They're bigger than they need to be, but there was an element of reduction in tax that could have actually been very productive, but maybe not quite so far. I think the approach well, first of all, just the administration in general, I just watch with absolute fascination because it's so
me too.
It's so out of my realm of sort of what I would expect a normal process that
it's the new abnormal, isn't it?
I almost feel like I'm watching from the outside entirely, and so that's interesting, really discouraging, hopeful at points. So it's all different types of emotions. I think on something like the tariffs, frankly, it's not my approach. There are a lot of things that I find distasteful about the approach, but I think it's too early to say whether or not it's a good approach. I mean, so do I worry about a 5% correction or even a 10% correction in the market on a short-term basis? No. I mean, you have to take a longer-term view than that. So to the last part of the question, that's not actually my concern at all if tariffs caused a blip in the market. It's more about longer-term trends. And is this a process that brings people to the table and have different negotiations? We'll see.
That could be good.
It feels like a risky approach, but we'll see.
All right. If you have questions, please just jump up. Don't be shy. We won't be. Sir.
There are 2 dams on the west side of Houston. I think one of them is called Addicks.
Addicks and Barker.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Can you tell us the history of those 2 dams? And the purpose of those dams and whether they helped or hurt during the hurricane?
So Addicks and Barker, sort of the west side of Houston, big flood back in the 40s, I think it was, in Houston. Recognized, almost the exact same situation we're talking about today in terms of Harvey, but recognized that something had to be done to protect Houston from basically overland flow of water in a big rain event. So this is not a new topic by any means. The flood they had was so bad back then that they actually rallied together this political and financial will to build these 2 big reservoirs to the west side of town that for decades now have protected in a serious way a big part of Houston. During Harvey, there was concern about would Addicks, for example, would it be possible if that reservoir dam failed? That basically would have flooded Houston all the way through the west side of town, through downtown, all the way to Galveston Bay. So it's a very serious issue. They serve a very important process. Now, water, for reasons we won't go into, water was released towards the end of the Harvey rainfall because those reservoirs were filling up, and for various reasons it was determined that water had to be released, which caused a great deal of water to run down the bayou. Similar kind of scenario up around the San Jacinto River, which flooded another 4,000 or 5,000 homes, many of which had never flooded before.
Why did you say let's not talk about it? When
Only because the story's too long.
Well, no, but you're not shielding the blame for that.
No,
from
I'm not.
somebody.
I'm not. I'm just saying the assessment was made that the risk assessment was made that the better solution was to release water and make sure there wasn't a failure.
Was that a good
as opposed
decision?
I don't know. Because again, I've got so many things to do. Looking back and evaluating
not productive. Except that it informs what happens going forward.
It does, but that's not actually so difficult. So what needs to happen now is there's some fixes around there that are being studied, and that'll actually probably take a couple of years. But it's pretty clear that the number one priority in this flood mitigation system is to increase the capacity of those two reservoirs and shore up the water holding facility so that you don't have that risk of failure in the future. There's even conversation about whether or not a third reservoir would be helpful as part of this bigger system.
And what's your opinion about that?
I think that's really unclear, actually. And so that brings me to another point that I wanted to mention earlier, Evan, too, is there's probably on the order of $6 billion coming to the area, both raised locally from the federal government to the Army Corps of Engineers and a bunch of others, to fix flood mitigation type issues, to fund some of those projects. That's extremely important. It's not too hard to figure out what the high priority projects are. Those are pretty well identified. That money needs to get spent and that protection provided as quickly as possible. I will submit to you, though, that that's not actually the way to define the issue. So a $6 billion, say 10 to 15 year infrastructure problem is a subset of a $35 billion 30-year program that actually needs to be put in place if you want to really protect the city, not just from heavy rainfall and overland flow, but also from surge protection from a hurricane that comes up the ship channel, which would be a devastating event that would make Harvey look like a much relatively small event. So that has to be put in place. So what the city, we go back to the topic of coordination, the city, the county, the state, and ultimately an element for the federal government as well. And we have to take the impetus, this is an area where local government has to step up and do this, is put that blueprint together of what that 3-decade, $35 billion program looks like. Clearly identify the priorities in there, the value, the benefit that comes from having that in place, and then sort out the funding. Which I think will come from all of those different elements we mentioned, as well as there's a role for business in doing that, doing that as well. That blueprint has to be put in place because basically the broader community has to accept that this is the long-term plan for the Houston area so that it transcends any one administration of a mayor or a county judge or anything else. It has to be bigger than that. And that's something that hopefully the shift in political will post-Harvey will allow us to get that in place so that it has that sort of stickiness and lasting effect that allow it to happen.
Ma'am.
Yes, hi. Carrie Stevens from Moody College of Communication. I'm really curious, Mr. Odum, I know that you have done a lot of work promoting the idea of volunteers and tracking volunteer hours. Is there some type of a social media app or some way that you are promoting the idea of how citizens and communities that are doing so much great work in the greater Houston area can contribute and directly help you build those volunteer hours to get those federal funds?
No, I really appreciate that. So we do have a system that's there. I'll give my group here to shout if there's a particular action. We'll connect you if there's a particular way into that system. I'll tell you something that we found, and I'll look to make sure that you nod that I'm correct here.
Yep.
We built a city for the system. We have the capability of doing that, but there's quite a bit of that in the community already. And we actually weren't able to build something that was better than what the community has. So going to those established group, Catholic Charities, some of the big organized groups out there for collecting volunteers is still a good way to do it. The system that you'll see coming out from the city, and this will have all the systems around it as well, is around those more professional-oriented services that can go towards these permanent projects. So legal, engineering, design, materials, chairs for schools, whatever it happens to be. That's a system that we'll come out specifically with because we can do that whereas nobody else can.
Good. Sir.
I think you talk a lot about the funding, obviously coming from the federal and the state levels, but Can you expand a little bit on some opportunities and ideas where public-private collaboration can come into play, and kind of where you see that as being a part of this overall mitigation and resilience strategy?
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up, because it has to be a big component of this piece going forward. So I'll just pick on one example, because I'm still pretty cloudy in this space. I'm optimistic about it, but it's not exactly clear how we're going to make it work yet. But think about the scenario I mentioned with a hurricane coming up the ship channel. There's a one estimate would be $500 billion of enterprise value, all the chemical plants and other industry in and around the Houston ship channel that are totally vulnerable to that situation. So there has to be a solution, and there's elements of this working around the globe right now, where the protection that would be provided by a coastal surge system and gates across across Galveston Bay, the protection that would provide to that industry is a valuable thing, right? And businesses are very adept at understanding what the risk is and what the value of that risk is. So having this combination somehow where there's a contribution to that risk protection and value protection from that enormous enterprise value that's there, as well as the public sources, is the problem that I am sure there's a solution for.
Well, it's like an insurance policy.
It's like an insurance, but it's very similar to that, but there's a big disconnect in timing, right? Yeah. When am I going to give you the money, and when am I going to be sure that I actually have that protection? And so solving that problem through some creative way, I think, is the next big step.
Good. Ma'am.
Good morning. A study recently came out from Rice University demonstrating social inequity and wealth gain after disasters. You mentioned equity being a challenge in recovery. What are you doing to address the challenge?
Yeah, social inequity in the sense that people of lower means suffer disproportionately following a disaster.
Yeah, and the study demonstrated that people of color consistently lose wealth after a disaster compared to...
How do you address that problem?
It's such an important question, and so we're doing that in a number of different ways. And actually, I can tell you at the outset that I am extremely proud of both the city and the county and the approach that's being taken on what I would call an equitable recovery. So from a housing standpoint, I mean, frankly, the perspective is that the money in priority order needs to go to those that are least able to help themselves. And there's some pretty decent ways now of calculating where the damage is, and where the damage is such that with all the socioeconomic data you have and the knowledge of those individuals, that they're basically in a position where they cannot recover. They'll just continue to go downhill from here based on what they've experienced. Those become the priority areas. We work in concert with, I mentioned the advocate groups out there before, who very much take the perspective of an equitable housing recovery and take that viewpoint into how we're designing these systems. The two more aspects I want to mention. From the infrastructure standpoint, because one of the ways you have to look at disaster recovery is it's all these elements moving forward in parallel. And I'm a little off track here, but it's redesigning how development is done, all the regulations around how you build subdivisions, everything else, and we're doing that, and we've done a lot of that. It's distributing this housing program with a very specific orientation towards fixing the affordable housing situation in Houston. So part of the equity issue is we're running out of affordable housing. It's going to be an increasing problem. So as we have $1 billion or more in Houston and $2 billion when you add in the county to spend in the area, how do we direct that towards strategically building large, increased capacity and affordable housing, and thinking through the elements of not just building affordable housing to start with, but keeping it affordable over the next decades, which is a big problem around housing typically. It gets built, it's affordable, values go up, it gets sold, it's no longer affordable. And I think the last one I want to mention is the infrastructure side. So interestingly, the federal government, there's some sort of perverse incentives that I think everybody would have some good rationale to fix out there. As you look to invest federal dollars on infrastructure, there's what's called a benefit cost analysis that has to be done in most cases. Now, the strange thing about that then is if you're in an area with very high property values and so forth, that benefit cost ratio looks much better because you're protecting high value homes and all. But the opposite is true as well. So if you're in an area that's disadvantaged, that has very low property values, you could put in some flood protection, but that ratio doesn't look as good. In some cases, doesn't qualify for the federal funds. And so think about it this way, the people of Houston have spoken in a way in that the Harris County just raised $2.5 billion through a bond for infrastructure across Houston and Harris County. And what we're able to do now is actually direct the federal money where it can apply and where it can basically meet those ratios, and take that money that's being raised more locally then and apply that to areas that are, that don't qualify or otherwise disadvantaged, and therefore get, from a flood mitigation standpoint, a more equitable recovery.
Yeah.
That's where my pride in the entities comes from.
Good. I'm being told that it's 9 o'clock and we're past our time here, so we have to say, with apologies to the people who wanted to ask questions, we have to say thank you so much to Marvin Odum and to the McCombs School for today's event. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate all of you being here. Thanks again. We'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.